Hi there, Emily.
Hi there, Mr. Frost.
Hi there. I should probably address you as Dr. Emily Grossman.
No, you
Lovely,
don't need to do that.
lovely to see you. Well, actually, I think that the young people and children listening just now would probably be interested to know how it is that you're a doctor, because of course, to a lot of people, a doctor is someone that you see when you're ill. Hi there, Emily.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the sort of doctor that is a science doctor.
I should probably address you as Dr. Emily Grossman.
No, you don't need to do that.
Lovely to see you.
Oh, I'm getting a lot of echo. I can just hear lots of speaking on the line.
Seems to be an echo, doesn't there?
Yeah. I'm hearing you speaking now. Absolutely. So I'm the sort of doctor that is
Okay, in case that echo was my problem, Emily, I'm just turning off my speakers and then switching to microphone, hopefully, headphones. Hopefully that will solve the technical problem. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Great. And I can hear you.
That's great.
Okay. Right, we'll make a start then.
In answer to your question, so some people think that doctors are only medical doctors, but actually anyone who's got something called a PhD means that they can put doctor in front of their name. Now, a PhD is when you study for a period of time, at least 3 to 4 years, learning lots and lots of information and detail about something very particular. And in my case, I did a PhD in science, specifically in biology, which meant that I spent 3 years working in a laboratory as a scientist, doing experiments and putting things in test tubes and discovering things. And then I had to, at the end of that, I had to write a big sort of book about my discoveries, which is called a thesis. And then I had to do an exam on it. And then at the end of that, I finished that period of research, and that makes me Dr. Emily. So I actually left science for a while after that time, and I decided to train in the other thing that I love doing. I've always loved science, but also I've always loved theatre and singing and dancing and performing. So I actually, after I finished my PhD and became Dr. Emily Grossman, I went to drama school and I trained as an actress and singer and spent a lot of time, about 8 years, working in plays and musicals. Then I worked as a maths and science teacher. And now I kind of combine all the things I love doing, which is making sense of the world and solving problems and understanding the world, that science side of things, with the part of me that likes performing and communicating as an actress and a performer, and also the part of me that loves helping others to understand the world and to fulfill their potential as a teacher. And I combine those now as a science communicator, which means that I give talks like this one here today. I write books about maths and science, like the book that Brain Fizzing Facts that some of you guys might have heard about. And I also do some work on the TV and radio as a kind of science explainer. So some of you might have seen me on a show in Sky called Backstory Echo, or various other TV shows or on the news. So I sort of, that's, for me, that's like the perfect way of combining all the things that I love doing.
So our theme today, of course, is food, farming, and we're particularly focusing about agriculture and the growing of the produce that we eat. Now, we take for granted the food that we eat, don't we? And we expect to see well-stocked supermarket shelves. And we also know that there are places in the world people frequently go hungry, but so much goes into producing the food we all need. How would you describe or summarize the challenges ahead?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, we do take for granted that we can just get food on the table. And of course, that's not true for everyone. There are a lot of people who are struggling to eat, even now in this country, in UK, where I am and where we are. But also due to COVID, there's been a lot of people who are already seeing challenges with financial challenges of getting enough to eat. But also there's other parts of the world where challenges in getting enough to eat is happening in huge quantities because of the challenges to do with extreme weather and to do with climate change and many other challenges. And that is something that we will potentially see more of in countries like the UK. So, you know, we are right to be talking about this. It's a very important topic that we're talking about how we're going to feed the world's population, because there's already challenges today. And as climate change gets worse and things sort of accelerate, unless we make big changes now, then it's likely that it will get harder to feed the world's growing population, because it's not just that the crops that we grow today are in some ways under challenge, under threat, which we can talk about a bit more about in a moment, but also the fact that our population is growing. You know, our population is growing by about 70 million people every year. That's more than the entire population of the UK. That's the global population, which is great. You know, it's great for many reasons, but one of the challenges is that we have to feed and have access to fresh water for all the new people on the planet. And it's estimated that by the year 2050, we're going to need twice as much food to be able to feed everybody. And the issues is that not only in some parts of the world is there not enough food already, but actually even where there is, then actually food production by our traditional methods, or methods we've been using, is already going down, is going to continue to go down, because of how we're using our land, because of damage to the land and the soil and deforestation, and also because of climate change. So this is definitely something where we need to be thinking about how we're going to find new ways or increase the use of less traditional ways of growing food, sort of from now and into the future.
Indeed, and I really adore fresh bread. I'm sure you do as well. You know, and I'm hearing that, you know, we need to have different grains, and that there are problems with growing and eating too much of the same thing. And that's something that you particularly could tell us a bit more about. So,
I mean, the biggest issues really is in terms of how the food crops that we eat are farmed. So the biggest issues are the fact that by farming crops in a certain way, so-called big agriculture, which is what we're here to talk about today, sometimes known as intensive farming or intensive agriculture, by using those techniques, such as something called monoculture, where you have just one type of crop in a field. So you were talking about, you know, for example, trying different grains. You know, traditionally we've just grown one type of crop in a field called monoculture. And I say traditionally, but we've got to be careful here that actually, if we go back, you know, thousands of years ago,
we were actually growing things in a much more sustainable way. But certainly for the last 150 or couple of hundred years, we've been increasingly kind of farming in a way that's not so sustainable. So this whole monoculture idea, where you just grow one crop in a field, just simply one type of crop, which is good for, you know, it's efficient in the sense that it's good for farmers because it means you can use heavy machinery and tractors and you can plant it all at the same time, and it saves money in some senses. But actually that's a sort of what's known as a kind of false economy, because actually the long-term impacts are really negative, because it means that we're reducing the diversity of things that can be grown. It means that we're using a lot of land, when actually if we were growing kind of several different crops side by side, we could be using the land in a much better way. And we could also be finding different ways to plough the fields, such that the fields weren't getting all kind of churned up all the time by heavy machinery, which is actually also bad for the environment. And we can talk a bit more about why that is. So yeah, the most important thing now really is that we start to realize that we need to be very careful with what we do eat, in the sense that actually one of the biggest issues is how much food we waste. So about half of the world's food every year is actually wasted. You know, we either buy too much and we throw it away, or it goes to the supermarkets and people don't pick it because it doesn't look perfect. And there's a whole movement now about like ugly fruits and ugly vegetables, and encouraging people to buy stuff that doesn't look kind of like the perfect thing you want to eat, but actually tastes fine and is very healthy. So we need to be buying only the amount of food that we actually need, so that we waste less. And we could actually solve a lot of the world's problems if we wasted a lot less food. All of the food waste each year would make a pile that's 8 times higher than the Eiffel Tower in Paris. I mean, that's a lot of food waste. So that's one thing we can be doing. But another thing is that we can be looking for foods that are grown in a more sustainable way. So you talked about, like, you know, bringing diversity and variety into our diets, but also we can be buying food if we can afford it, and of course that's challenging. It can be buying food that's grown organically, which means that it's grown maybe, like I said, with less of a monoculture and more different crops side by side. Also means it's grown in a way that uses less chemicals, so less chemical fertilizers to sort of fertilize the soil. It might use natural manure, for example, instead, like basically animal poo, in a way that uses less pesticides. So that's chemicals that are traditionally used to destroy insects that would damage the crops, but there's ways of doing that more naturally. And organic farming can actually at times help protect the soil. One of the big issues is, like I said, when we're ploughing up the soil, not only does that damage the soil and makes it in the future harder to grow crops, if we're ploughing it up, many times by intensive agriculture, but also ploughing up the soil releases greenhouse gases, so carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. And most of you listening probably already know about greenhouse gases and how that makes our fluffy blanket around the earth that keeps us warm at night. It makes it get a bit thicker, and that traps heat in the atmosphere, and that causes changes to our weather systems and our climate. So we can waste less food. We can be looking out for food that is grown organically or sustainably, if that's something that our budgets will allow. We could even grow our own food in a way that is much more protective of the soil and the earth and uses less chemicals. Another thing that we can do is we can try and buy things that are grown locally, because another big problem with the food industry is all of the chemicals, the greenhouse gases that are released by transporting the food from one part of the world to another. So, lorries or trains, well, not so much trains, but lorries, boats, aeroplanes, burn fuel. Fuel is petrol or diesel, and that's a fossil fuel. When that gets burnt, it's useful, it releases energy, but it also releases carbon dioxide. And that is really just talking about the plants and the crops that we eat. You mentioned bread, fruit and vegetables. Those are all the sort of crops that we eat. But also then we have to look at what we're doing in terms of livestock. So that's farming animals for meat, sort of beef and lamb, dairy, eggs, cheese, milk, all of those industries. We really also need to be aware of what that's doing to the planet.
In our school garden, we've been trying to take stock of looking after the soil. So, we're very conscious to grow different vegetables in different patches and swap them around. We've also been told not to compost or to use compost which has got peat in it. We also had our friend Jamie Normington from Cumbria Wildlife Trust come into school and tell us about peat bogs and how important they are.
Yeah.
So certainly our pupils that are listening would be delighted if you could tell us a bit more about the importance of peat bogs.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm really glad you raised that, because a lot of people don't really know about peat bogs. But peat bogs peat bogs are a type of wetland, and wetlands sort of overall our soil, so they count as part of our soil. And like I already mentioned, we're damaging our soil because of intensive agriculture and farming. We've actually damaged about a third of our soils now across the globe, which is, considering that 95% of what we eat relies on healthy soil, relies on our soil being juicy and fertile. We've damaged a lot of it. But it's even worse for wetlands. So wetlands, we've damaged or destroyed about half of all wetlands, which is a huge amount. And peat bogs are a type of wetland. So peat bogs contain peat soil, which is a very rich, fertile type of soil. And as you said, it's often used as a fertilizer. It's often used not as a fertilizer, but to put on your garden, because it's very rich in kind of organic matter, such as dead plants and animals that kind of feed the soil and feed the plants that grow in it. But the problem is that, as I mentioned, the churning up of the soil using repeated ploughing with big agriculture, or the compaction of the soil from cattle or tractors, so farming cows or sheep or using heavy tractors. Both of those actually cause the soil to be able to hold less of its carbon, which is trapped in dead plants and animals in the soil. And the thing with peat is that peat bogs actually contain huge amounts of carbon. Like there's more carbon, I believe, in the peat bogs than there are trapped in the oceans. We talk about conserving trees and trapped in forests. There's also carbon trapped in the oceans, but it's the forests that trap a lot of carbon dioxide, which is why it's so important we don't chop all our forests down and that we don't then burn them and release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. But peat bogs in particular contain way more carbon than even the forests. So we really need to keep that carbon in the soil, because if we start to destroy the peat bogs, then the carbon comes out of the soil back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and we have an even worse situation with global warming. So the reason that peat bogs are currently under threat is because they're a type of wetland. They don't tend to be used for farming, but they often get drained. So often, like, the water gets pulled out of them, and then the land gets used to make extra fields for farming, for agriculture, or for grazing cattle. So a huge amount of the world's peat bogs are kind of getting lost, either because people are digging them up and selling them off for people in their gardens, or because they're being drained to create agriculture, or because they're being drained to create more roads and more houses. But the thing is, we ought to be really protecting these peat bogs. So yeah, using peat soil is a very good way of making your soil very rich and full of carbon, so that it can hold on to that from stop it being released back into the atmosphere.
And we're growing a small woodland in our school grounds, and are just about to plant 3 types of apple tree as well, which we're really excited about. And I know that you've talked a lot about food forests, and is there anything else that we could think about in schools?
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned food forests. So what I talked about before was kind of how important it is that when we grow stuff, we grow a diversity of things next to each other. Because that not only means that we can use the land more efficiently, we can fit more things together, but it also means that those plants can actually sort of look after each other in a sense. They can provide each other with protection, or with sort of fertile soil, the nutrients in the soil, but also it can encourage a wide range of different insects to be able to grow in and around those plants. And of course, insects are crucially important because it's insects that pollinate the crops that help them to grow. So they all sort of help each other. So another way that sort of agriculture can be made more sustainable, better for the land, better for the environment, is something called agroforestry. So that's growing crops in and around trees. So agro means, well, agriculture and forestry put together. So by growing crops kind of in an area where there's also trees, the trees can help to protect the soil, and they can help to kind of, again, look after each other. And then you mentioned forest gardening or food forests. So that's a really wonderful idea. So that's the idea of having lots of different plants all growing in one area, all intertwined with each other, almost like you would get in a natural forest. But the difference is you can choose to plant plants and crops that are all edible. So a food forest is literally that. It's a forest that is full of food. So of course you can get lots of nutritious food from that, whilst protecting the soil, because you're not churning it up constantly. And once you've actually planted that food forest, it can pretty much look after itself, because all of the insects kind of compete with each other, so they keep each other's numbers down, so you don't get a huge amount of one particular type of insect that might kill off all the crops. What we're always looking for in biology and in sort of the planet is we're looking for diversity. We're looking for what's known as biodiversity. So that means lots of different types of insects, lots of different types of plants. So a food forest is perfect for that. And then it means you need, again, less chemicals. So you don't need to fertilize it so much, because a lot of the problem is with chemical fertilizers is that chemical fertilizers, which are again used in big agriculture, release a chemical called nitrous oxide. And some of you might have heard of the fact that nitrous oxide is another greenhouse gas, like carbon dioxide, but actually much worse at much better at trapping heat in the atmosphere. So it's actually much worse for global warming. So, and of course, if you can get by without using pesticides to kill off the insects, because they're killing off each other instead, not killing them off, but keeping the numbers sort of at a good level, then that means that there's going to be much less damage to other insects that might, or bigger creatures that can actually get damaged by using chemical pesticides. And it means that there's less pollution running off through the soil into the rivers and lakes by the use of those kind of chemical pesticides. So a food forest is a really wonderful way to grow nutritious food in a really sustainable way that looks after the soil and that looks after the atmosphere and therefore looks after the planet.
So it sounds to me that what we need to do is encourage lots of diversity rather than just growing the same things in a large area. We need to mix things up a bit more.
Exactly.
So I suppose we can, in school gardens and school forests, we can think about doing a bit more of that. And we know that eating a more plant-based diet is a good idea.
Yes, great. I'm glad you mentioned that.
But you know, what other alternatives are there?
Yeah, good point. So, you know, I just want to talk for a moment about why plant-based diets are so much more important. So I've already mentioned that in terms of the fruits and vegetables and grains and cereals that we eat, it's good to get stuff that's been grown organically or sustainably. But what about the other huge kind of elephant in the room, so to speak, is like, what about the other stuff that a lot of us eat? So that's milk and meat and particularly beef and lamb, which are particularly challenging for the planet. And if I can just kind of explain why for a moment, and then we'll talk about what the alternatives are. So the challenge with grazing cattle and sheep, well, can you tell us, Mr. Frost, what is it particularly about cows? Any idea what it is particularly about cows that is problematic?
Well, I think it's the gases that are produced.
And how are they produced?
Well, that's by digesting large quantities of grass and producing methane.
In their
poo and in their other.
Great.
Yeah. Well, I don't have to say the word that you're trying to get me to say.
I just thought. Say again?
I'm going to behave and just let you give us the science. Give us the science.
I'm teasing Mr. Frost here because I really just want him to say fart on air in front of lots of primary school kids. But yes, I'm sure you all know that one of the reasons that grazing livestock like cows and sheep is particularly bad for the planet is because of all of the methane gas that sheep and cows, particularly cows, produce in their burps and their farts. There's a lot of that methane coming out. There are about 1.5 billion cows on the planet. That's a lot of cows. And each of those burps and farts about, well, enough methane in a day, just one cow in one day, enough methane to fill 15 party balloons. That's a lot of methane. And methane is a very potent, that means quite a strong greenhouse gas, in the sense that when it goes into the atmosphere, it traps a lot of heat. It thickens our fluffy blanket of greenhouse gases and traps a lot of heat in the atmosphere. So that's one of the reasons why actually we really, really need to be cutting down on the amount of cows and sheep that we farm, and of course in the amount of milk that they produce, and cheese and cow dairy. And one way that we can encourage farmers to cut down on that, of course, is that farmers only rear cattle and livestock in order to feed us, in order to give us beef burgers and lamb and milk. So basically, it's what's known as supply and demand. So if we don't consume or eat or drink as much of that stuff, then the farmers aren't going to be encouraged to make so much of it and put it on the supermarket shelves. So not only does rearing cattle, livestock, produce lots of methane, so that's one reason why it's bad for the environment, that is. Another reason is that I already said before that livestock graze on the land. They use up a huge amount of space. And we're running out of space on the planet. And in order to create that space, we've already heard that we're draining peat bogs, but also we're cutting down trees. That's adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It's reducing our wildlife even more. It's getting rid of the habitats of where wild creatures live. So we really need to be looking after and reducing the amount of land that we use for farming, not actually using more and more of it to graze cattle, because cattle is a very inefficient way of using land, because they take up an enormous amount of space but actually only provide us with a small amount of the calories that we actually need to eat. Most of that comes from plants anyway. So if we're talking about relatively speaking, that it would be much better if we were to just replace all of the calories and the protein that we usually eat with meat from the meat in our diet, if we were to replace that with just extra amounts of beans and peas and legumes, lentils, so lots of more plant-based foods, or tofu, that have a lot of protein, because of course we still do need to get our protein. And scientists have actually said that if we're going to keep global warming to below where it really becomes dangerous, and it already is dangerous in certain parts of the world. Let's be clear about this. But if we're going to keep it below what's sort of internationally agreed as the sort of dangerous level, then in wealthy nations such as the UK and America, we're actually going to need to reduce our average meat consumption, particularly beef and lamb, or beef actually is this particular number, by 90%, which means eating 10 times less as many kind of beef burgers, ideally none at all. And it's not just what it does to the greenhouse gases in terms of the methane. It's also, like I said, this compaction of the land, which means that more of the carbon gets kind of less plants can grow on that land because it's been squashed down. And it also, it reduces the ability of the soil to hold on to its carbon. So again, more of the carbon gets released as carbon dioxide. So there are many reasons why actually livestock farming is really one thing that we can all be aware of in terms of simple changes to our own diets that could really help. And again, no one's saying that you have to go totally vegan. No one's saying that you have to stop eating meat entirely. But if you're able to just reduce and cut down a little bit, maybe try, a couple of days a week where you go plant-based, or plant-based means mostly plants, but you could try a plant-based overall diet, so mostly plants, and maybe have, a couple of days, if you've not done it already, when you're totally vegan. And actually, a lot of people find that once you start cutting down a little bit, you realize that actually we don't need as much of the sort of milk and beef and lamb as we thought we did. So, sometimes scientists have actually said that in terms of what we can do personally, cutting down on meat is one of the best ways that we can look after the planet. And of course, there's other personal things like to do with how we travel, and that's obviously not the topic for this talk today. But in terms of what we eat, it's wasting less food, buying organic or sustainable things, crops grown in that way, and eating less meat and dairy. And then, of course, as you said, Mr. Frost, it's all about like what we do with how we can actually help in our own schools in terms of what we can grow ourselves and what we can eat ourselves. Oh, and of course, with livestock farming as well, you've got all the crops that are needed to feed the cows and the sheep. It's not just the land required for the cows and sheep. About 4/5 of the planet's farmlands are used for cows and sheep for grazing. That's a huge amount, and they don't produce more than less than about 1/5 of our calories. But about 1/3 of the crops on this planet are also grown to feed the animals. They're not grown for us, they're grown to feed the animals. So altogether, if we got rid of all of that and we got rid of all sort of animal products from our diets, we could actually free up about 75% of the planet's lands, and we could use it for much more useful things like providing habitats for wildlife or sustainable farming, and we could reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by nearly 1/3. So it really is quite a big deal what we can do by being aware of meat and dairy and the impact that has.
So plenty of food for thought there, and we're looking in our school to think about having meat-free days. In fact, we've already got a few days where we're completely meat-free. So just cutting down is quite straightforward, isn't it? But just with the few minutes that we've got left, Emily, I was just wondering if you could just tell us, have you ever eaten any insects by any chance?
Oh, funny you should ask, because actually, some of you might have heard, and perhaps you have, which is why you asked the question, that one of the ways in which hopefully we're going to be able to solve all of these issues is in the future by moving more towards eating insects as our source of protein rather than eating meat. I mean, we can still be eating meat in the future. I must just say that this is important because in the future we could be eating beef and lamb, but beef and lamb grown in a laboratory, so that it's actually grown in a test tube rather than using any land and using any real cows. But that is something that is coming. It's going to be called lab grown or cultured meat. If you look out for it in the supermarkets, then they have done it in test tubes and grown beef burgers. Beef burgers. But at the moment, they're very, very expensive because scientists are just trying out the new technique. But hopefully in the future, you'll be able to eat lab-grown meat, and that will be totally, well, not totally, but much better for the environment. But yes, also in the future, as you rightly say, an exciting thing is that we could be eating more insects, because insects, that might sound absolutely revolting, but they actually taste quite nice. You can eat like, and a lot of people across the globe, about 2 billion people across the globe, actually do eat insects as part of their diet. And most of us will be eating tiny little bits of insects, about 400 tiny little bug bits in the just normal foods that we eat every day without even knowing it. In things like chocolate or coffee or flour, there are tiny little bits of bugs. And actually that's what adds a lot of the protein. So I've never actually, have I eaten? Yeah, think I have eaten a tiny bit of a bug in it. It did taste all right. But the point is that we can farm insects on huge quantities on tiny amounts of land because they're so small. And they don't need much food. They need 8 times less food than cows, for example. And you can eat pretty much the whole of an insect. Like with a cow, right? You can only eat certain bits of its body. But with an insect, you can pop the whole thing in your mouth. And it sounds disgusting, but most of it gets digested and very little of it comes out the other end in your poo. So actually, they're a very, very efficient way of feeding ourselves. And I think we're going to see more and more use of insects as a source of protein in the future. And that's definitely something we shouldn't be scared of. We shouldn't be freaked out by. It can actually taste very nice. Lots of different insects taste a variety of different things, so I'm told. And you can find out lots more about sort of different types of insects you can eat. You can sort of look on the internet or ask your teachers to maybe do a project on that, because it's a fascinating way in which our sort of food industry is moving forwards.
Well, that's another reason why we should be encouraging all of the insects by encouraging biodiversity, because not only are they fertilizing and pollinating, not only they're pollinating, but they may even provide us with additional things to put on our plates one day.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed listening to you, and you've got another session tomorrow, I believe.
I do on Friday for the closing session. And then I also just wanted to say, if anyone watching wants to kind of find out more about this or read more about not just food, particularly about food, but also about all the ways in which we're affecting our climate. So Brain Fizzing Facts is the book that is out at the moment of mine, which has lots of fun facts in it and a little bit about climate. But the second book is that I've written is called World Whizzing Facts, and that's out in May. And that contains lots more information about future of food and how we're going to be. You will already, by watching this talk, you'll know the answer to one of the questions. But lots of other facts about the world and how we're impacting it, and how we can look after the planet and how we can look after the living creatures that share it with us. So that's out in May, and you can pre-order it now online. That's called World Whizzing Facts. So look out for that.
I'll have to make sure I get a copy. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Don't know if anyone can hear me, but I also wanted to say, can you still hear me?
Yes.
So for anyone who's still tuned in, I've just been asked the name of my new book, which is called World Whizzing Facts. I'm going to type it into the chat box so that can be shared. World Whizzing Facts.
I just asked you in the chat. Yeah, I found your Brain Fizzing Facts, but that one's obviously already out. So yeah, World Whizzing Facts. Great.
Next one that's you can pre-order it online now on Amazon or on Bloomsbury Publishing website, which is who's publishing it. Brain Fizzing Facts is the one that's out already. And if anyone watching or listening wants to get in touch with me, you can find more information about me on my website, or if you want to talk to me about talking to children in your classroom in schools about other issues to do with this or to do with various other topics that I speak on, please do just get in touch with me. You can find me through my website. And if any teachers are on Twitter or Instagram, these are my details here. Please do send me a message or get in touch, or if you've enjoyed the session today and want to share about it, that would also be brilliant. So I'm at Dr. Emily Grossman on Twitter. I'm also at Dr. Emily Grossman 1 on Instagram. That's all in the chat box, which I believe some of you hopefully will have access to.
That's great. Yeah, because yeah, it's only us that can hear you.